Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this beautiful Earth Day, this cooler than usual Earth Day. For me, slightly cold. Anything under 70 is cold to me. But thank you for joining us inside on the computer on what is admittedly a very beautiful day for an Earth Day discussion on photography and landscape. Today, I'm your host. I'm Dr. Katie Geha. I'm the director of the Dodd Galleries at the Lamar Dodd School of Art, and also the director of the Athenaeum, a new art space that's just opened in downtown Athens. It's at 287 West Broad Street, and we currently have our MFA thesis exhibition up, and the hours are Thursday through Saturday, so please stop by and check out that amazing exhibition. At the Dodd, we're having our BFA shows up too, so lots and lots of student work to see. And today we're going to have a conversation with Tomiko Jones, Jeff Rich, and Marni Shindelman. And I'm just going to have a few opening remarks. Then I'm going to pass it to Marnie, who will discuss her work for about 7 to 10 minutes. Then Jeff will discuss his work, and then Tomiko Jones will discuss her work. After that, I'll probably have, no doubt, many follow-up questions, but we'll only ask a couple. And then we'll also open it up to the audience. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. I think we can't call on you, maybe the way this is set up, but definitely put it in the chat box, and I will read that question. So without further ado, thinking through this program, I, of course, immediately went as an art historian to the history of photography. Certainly not something that is my number one forte. I'm a contemporary art historian, but it was kind of the obvious place for me to start to think about this conversation. And the richness of the landscape seems to me to be such an obvious subject, perfect for photographers in terms of thinking about light and texture, and of course the grandeur of what the eye can behold. Especially too, not only thinking about the history of photography and the landscape, but the ways in which we've encountered the landscape in this past year, a year full of hardships from a global pandemic to racial injustice. And I think for me especially, really seeing how closely linked we are to one another, and also to the earth that we inhabit. In thinking about the history of photography, the stillness of the landscape allowed for long exposures. And later, artists began to experiment to push photography closer to what they would seem as a kind of art form, to create their own subjectivity within the landscape. Here, maybe also trying to align it with the importance of painting and impressionist painting. Also, they were proving what we all already know too well, that is photography can be as easily manipulated as any other art form, maybe through editing choices on behalf of the artist. A photograph is really very rarely ever a straight documentation. To the landscape, I think this year offered an escape for many. I don't know how many of you probably went on walks every day, or forced yourself to go on walks, or forced yourself to leave your house. And that in fact, oftentimes the natural world felt safer than our interior spaces, that we could meet friends outside and feel safe. Landscapes, of course, really hold so much metaphor, representing our understanding, say, of maybe the American West, an exploration of manifest destiny, or of course, always the inextricable link between ourselves and the surroundings we inhabit. Photographers often, of course, seek to express their interior thoughts and feelings through the landscapes they choose to photograph. Oftentimes I think of scale when I think about landscape. Of course, scale also in relationship to the point of where we are viewing the image. That is the point where the photographer took the image. So is this a God's eye view? Are we made to feel small, or are we made to feel quite large? This also relates to, I think, photography in 1950s on to the sort of idea of an urban landscape. How is our landscape, our natural landscape, intruded upon by capitalism, upon dwellings within the urban landscape? And that, of course, that urban landscape then is often rife and fraught with political implications. Striking to me when thinking about the work of Schindleman, Rich, and Jones's work is that while the landscape is what is often proffered in their pictures, it is also very much a stand-in, a mere prop, and that prop is used to explore other themes related to borders, industrialization, geopolitics, and sustainability. And while each artist deals with thorny and complicated topics within their work, they are also very much beholden to the sublime and nature in photography, a hearkening back to the history of landscape photography and its legacy of grandeur and grace. It is the tension between the beauty of the images and the deeply rooted politics interwoven, which makes these artists so compelling and so appropriate, what I hope is the tail end of a global pandemic and the beginning of serious police reform. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Marni Shindelman. Marnie's practice investigates the data tracks we amass through networked communication. Her work ties the invisible to actual sites, anchoring the ephemeral in photographs. Her latest work, Restore the Night Sky, looks at the influence privatized immigration detention centers have on the rural landscapes they inhabit. She works within a collaborative team, Larson and Schindleman, since 2007, and their work has been shown very widely at sites including the Denver Art Museum, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. They've held solo exhibitions at the George Eastman Museum, the Orlando Museum of Art. Their work has been represented in many publications from Wired, the New York Times, to NPR, the Washington Post, and they are often off in really sort of, I always think, exciting artist residencies, such as the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Lightwork, and then the CEC ArtsLink in St. Petersburg, Russia. In addition to being my wonderful colleague, Marni Shindelman received her MFA from the University of Florida and her Bachelor of Philosophy from Miami University. She's an associate professor at the Lamar Dodd School of Art at the University of Georgia, where she heads the photography area. Thank you, Marni.
Excellent, thank you. I'll stay on the slide for a minute. So let's see, I've been unmuted the whole time, sorry. Thank you guys so much. It's really nice to kind of get to share my work with my own colleagues. And I should say first, this is very new work for me. And Dave reached out to me originally and said, oh, I want to bring a couple people to talk about Earth Day. And I thought, Earth Day, my work doesn't really have much to do with environment. And then I backed up and thought, of course, it's perfect in this situation. And I think it's perfect also, or I was questioned because it's very new work. So I started this research. I had the joy of being at UGA a fellow to study in a second discipline. So I got to be a student in 2017 through 18, the academic year, in geography. And I specifically started to work with mapping, but of course was drawn to human geography, that's perfect, which was where I kind of stayed, which was where I felt most at home, and it's stuff I did in undergrad. So on the eve of, and so this work has developed, it's very fresh. I just this fall started showing a few images from the portfolio, and it's a beginning of a longer body. So on the eve of the pandemic, we had over 52,000 people daily in ICE detention. About 70% of people in ICE custody are held in privately housed prisons operated by private companies, with the majority of these in really rural parts. So next slide. And I started this work by, oops, a little shit. Oh, I can see it. I went to a graduate seminar as being a very dutiful student. And I heard Leanne Purdom, who is not here, I possibly didn't invite her because I was nerding out. I get really nervous around all my geography friends. But she said, I heard her give a lecture. Everyone was talking about what they did that summer. In her speech, she stands up and the first thing she says is, I couldn't take pictures of what I did this summer, but this is near what I did. And she shows this picture of the moon setting over a house, and it is the ranch house she lived at while working at the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, which is hands down the largest detention center which houses women and children. And that was the summer after children had been separated from their parents all summer, months on end, some going on upwards of a year or two, from their parents. And Leanne had witnessed that. And she said in her speech, she was talking and she's like, it's all over, it's everywhere, you can see it. You can see it in the night sky. And so next one, you can go forward. So I went with Leanne on a trip to the detention center. And my goal was very explicitly to not go into the detention center. I wanted to see what lay people could see. I wanted to see how this related. And what came about was there's so much work right now to be made there, and there's so many things I have going. But the first set I'm working on was I was standing on a roof just talking with some of the volunteers who really are running a lot of the aid and the help and a lot of the legal aid that's going on down there. And I was specifically working with people doing legal aid. And so I stood on the roof and they were like, will you photograph this tree? And I turned around and took a, a long exposure, 2 to 3 minute exposure. And all of a sudden I could see this distinct line across the entire landscape. And I had the detention center to my back. And I realized through my camera that what my camera could see was stuff I couldn't, that this was across the landscape. So you can go to the next slide. So what you're seeing are these images that I've started taking. I've been traveling across the US to various different places, photographing the light pollution from these detention centers. So the majority of people who are in detention centers are seeking asylum from atrocities and horrifying human rights violations, generally in Central America and South America, and they're awaiting their due process. Asylum is a process that we grant through the UN, international law, and we're defining refugees. The US is constantly redefining that, but this came about in 1951 in the wake of World War II, when most countries had refused to let anyone in who were fleeing persecution from the Nazis. So all of these refugee laws. So people who are in these are awaiting their time to be heard in the US to see if they have what's called credible fear. And that is one of the portions of becoming a refugee. So next slide. Let's see. So I decided that this moment, to kind of watch how people were moving across the landscape and how these very tiny towns, you can see each photograph in the project changes always, but is currently titled with a detainee capacity and the town population. So this is Irwin County, which is in Osceola, Georgia. It's like maybe 4 hours away south of Athens here, with a detainee capacity of 1,201 and the town population of 3,627. So generally it's a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio of detainee to town population. And these are not all ICE detention centers. You can see some are ICE. This is in Irwin County. So this is their federal prison that also doubles. I'm not sure if it's federal. It's actually the county prison that doubles as an ICE detention center. But what I'm most interested in is these private centers and the privatization and how we are having economies that are evident everywhere based around what is a questionable imprisonment of people. So forward on to the next one. So I have been traveling for a while. For the past 2 years, every time I travel, I kind of seek what centers. This was one, Tomiko, this is why I was absent from a conference we were at last year, because I was off photographing night things very late at night. And so I'll go out at night. You can see the detention center to the right here, but you can see how unnatural the light is on these. This is Livingston, Texas, just outside of Houston. Detainee capacity is 1-to-5, basically. So 20% the detention center can hold. So next one. Let's see. So this is the Stuart Detention Center, which is one of the largest ones outside of Texas. Texas is one of the largest places from the map I showed earlier. But this is Lumpkin, Georgia, very close to Columbus. And it is a huge civic core civic company. Core Civic is one of the largest police or prison privatization companies. And this is a huge one. Those are harder to photograph because they're harder to access, to kind of get closer to. But so what I've tasked myself, yeah, this is the last one, perfect. What I've tasked myself with in the next few years is attempting to kind of try and photograph these as, well, we have kind of, Biden has promised to shut these down. It was still kind of, must remember, they were all built by the Obama administration and then horribly abused by the Trump administration. So I'm trying to kind of photograph. Biden has promised he'll close all private prisons down. I don't have much hope that will happen, but there's a lot of rules and laws behind that will have to happen. But I'm attempting at this point to kind of watch the landscape and watch the landscape of these two political moments kind of come together. So thank you very much.
Thank you. What incredibly rich work. I already have many questions to ask you. But first, let's hear from Jeff Rich. Jeff Rich's work focuses on water issues, ranging from recreation and sustainability to exploitation and abuse. His watershed project has toured nationally since 2012. His work is housed in the collections of the Harvard Museum of Art, Library of Congress Print Collection, Middlebury College Museum of Art, Yale University, Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, the Asheville Art Museum, the High Museum of Art, and the Do Good Fund. In 2017, Fall Line Press published the book Watershed, the Tennessee River. Jeff's work was recently included in the SF MoMA exhibition and catalog American Geography, published by Radius Books, and will be featured in exhibitions at the Harvard Art Museum and the Portland Museum of Art in the near future. Jeff, take it away.
All right, thanks, Katie. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here today. So I'll just get right into it because I always go long. So starting with this slide, so I've been working on this project called the Watershed Project for about 16 years now. So I started in 2005, and the work looks at the system of the Mississippi River. So all the rivers that feed into the Mississippi River. And so the Mississippi watershed comprises about a third of the United States. It's about 40% of the United States. And so it's a massive project. And so that's why it's been such a long-winded project. And it all started when I was living in Asheville, North Carolina. And I realized that the 2 tropical storms that had just passed through caused like this massive amount of damage. And it was the term 100-year flood was thrown around a lot in my first few weeks living in Asheville, and I'd never heard that term before. And it's interesting because it's a term you hear kind of on a daily basis now, especially if you live near a floodplain. And so the work started with me looking at floodplain damage, and that led to a lot of research on figuring out, like what property was damaged, how the government was going to, give grants to fix the damage, clean up, stuff like that. And so I'd never really researched in that way before. And so the project, one of the reasons why the project has been so long-winded is because it's all about self-education for me. So I didn't really know anything about the system of rivers or watersheds before. And so as I worked with nonprofit organizations in the area, the French Broad Riverkeeper was one of the biggest ones. I would sort of like do my homework, right? I would do research online, but then I would literally just sit down with the riverkeeper and ask questions. I was constantly being sort of educated on the river. And so a big sort of moment came when I realized that the French Broad River, which is if you don't know where that is, it's in Western North Carolina. It flows directly through the middle of Asheville. And I living there, I just thought the French Broad ended up in the Atlantic Ocean, right? So it flowed, somehow magically got to the Atlantic Ocean. And so the French Broad Riverkeeper lets me know that it actually flows into the middle of the country, through Tennessee, and then joins the Tennessee River, and then joins the Ohio River, which then joins the Mississippi River, which then ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So that sort of moment of realization that I really had no idea how these rivers worked led me to start doing a lot of research and start trying to figure out, what that means, what a system of watershed means. And for me, that really meant sorry, we can stay on this slide for a second. That really meant kind of researching all of these different places. So how do we use the river? So I'm really interested in how we use the river recreationally, but I'm also interested in the flip side of that on how we abuse the river. And so, I documented places like the place you saw on the first slide, which was paper mill, which is called the Blue Ridge Paper Mill. And it's a paper mill that's been around since about the early 20th century and just dumps, tons of pollution into the Pigeon River, which they call the Dirty Birdie, I think is what they call it. And so that plant has gone back and forth between polluting and non-polluting and sort of cleaning up and then sort of breaking their permit. These permits are sort of given to these big companies to release a set amount of pollution into the environment. And so that project was kind of interested in the sort of dichotomy in the French Broad watershed between this sort of heavily used river for recreation, but also heavily polluted river that was on the verge of cleaning up, but was sort of backsliding throughout the sort of early 2000s, mid 2010. And so you can go to the next slide. So I documented also sustainability, questions of sustainability like river cleanups. The next image was sort of the end of this project. And this image is actually an image of Steve Harris's chair. And so Steve Harris was an individual that lived right across the river from a place called Nuclear Fuel Services. And so Nuclear Fuel Services processes used uranium, highly enriched uranium, and they reprocess it, and it's used in like nuclear submarines for their fuel. But as they're reprocessing it, they have had like a huge sort of record of spills in the local town, which is Erwin, Tennessee. And so the town itself was basically bringing a class action lawsuit against Nuclear Fuel Services. And Steve was a huge part of that. And so I went and spent about a week with Steve in his home on his land. He owned about 15 acres right across the river, the Nolichucky River, from the plant. And he was in this sort of like crisis mode because he had just found out about that his land was heavily polluted with plutonium and uranium radiation. And so this land had been used for years as like gathering places for sort of traveling nomads. They'd have these big festivals there. And so when I met him, he was in this like major crisis mode, and he was also part of this lawsuit. So this image in particular kind of shows all the research he was doing. And that sort of, he kind of turned away from the landscape, and he became this sort of like person that just spent a lot of time inside researching. And he actually, unfortunately, about a year after this series was shot, he actually ended up committing suicide. Okay, sorry, next image. And so while all this was happening, there was a massive flood at the Kingston fossil plant over in Harriman, Tennessee. And so this coal, it was a coal fly ash, basically flood. So the coal fly ash is a byproduct of burning coal, and it gets stored in these massive ponds that are right outside of these coal-fired power plants. And so what the dike that held back all this coal fly ash broke, and all this coal fly ash spread out into the surrounding countryside, which was mostly farms, but it was also the joining of two rivers. It was the confluence of two rivers. And so it was actually, in terms of volume, it was actually larger than the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010. So it's like one of the biggest industrial accidents in the United States history. And so if you look at this image, you can actually see behind the orange fence there, that kind of gray slurry, that's all coal ash. And if you go back to this location now, that farm in the background is gone. All this is now just a park that's been literally just covered up by the TVA and the EPA over the span of about, let's see, about 7 years that it took them to clean up this plant. And so this started my work on the Tennessee watershed, which is completely controlled, if you don't mind going to the next slide, completely controlled by the Tennessee Valley Authority, or harnessed is a better word. And so if you look at, this is the cover of the book that we produced for this series. If you look at this image, I became really fascinated in how sort of much control the TVA has over this watershed. So each one of those little black dashes you see there is a dam that's been built by the TVA. And so they really control the whole watershed. Keep going. And so what I wanted to do was look at the TVA's facilities, but also their effect on the landscape and the people living in the landscape. So this image shows the Black Belt citizens for, I'm sorry, that's a mouthful. Black Belt Citizens for Health and Justice, and their fight against the pollution from that coal ash spill, which ended up in Uniontown, Alabama, in their landfill. And it wasn't controlled, it's not being controlled, it's not being treated the same way that they would treat it if it was still in Tennessee. As soon as it crosses state lines, it becomes, it no longer is hazardous waste. So they can treat it however they want. They can just treat it like anybody's, trash from their house. And so a lot of that pollution is spreading out into Uniontown, Alabama. And so they're fighting to get it removed. And I realize I'm running short on time here, so I'll keep going. So these are a couple spreads from the book. I was interested in how the TVA went from being this New Deal agency that was supposed to lift up the Mid-South out of poverty into, and it was this sort of idealized, agency, and it transformed into this agency that really was just interested in producing cheap electric power. And so kind of go into that a little bit in the books. And I start, keep going, I start looking at the legacy of pollution caused by a lot of this industry. And so this image is an image that these are monitoring wells, monitoring radiological contamination of a river in Western Kentucky. And so I was really interested in these kind of hidden in plain sight places where you wouldn't know this was there unless you had already looked it up. Or you're just this was actually a place where a lot of hunters and fishermen go. And so you come upon this place in the middle of the woods, and there's all these monitoring wells, and then there's all these signs along the river that say that you can't eat the fish out of the river, you can't enter the river, you can't disturb the sediment because of all the heavy radiological contamination. All right, next one. Just because I'm going long, I'm gonna go a little bit faster, I'm sorry. So I've also started working on the western portion of the watershed. So I'm out in Colorado, Idaho, and Montana. This is an image from Walden, Colorado. This is the headwaters of the North Platte River. And if you can see those little flares in the background, those are actually fracking wells. And so I've just really started very, sort of loosely on this project, but I'm really interested in the headwaters of these rivers and whether or not they're sort of these pristine headwaters, which is what the Clean Water Act calls for, is a sort of pristine watershed, or pristine headwaters, I'm sorry. So I've been visiting all the different headwaters of the Western rivers. And then we just go to the last slide. And then this is very new, just like Marnie, this is very, very new. I've started doing video work of each headwaters and also the confluences. So a confluence is where two rivers meet. And I've been doing these video sound pieces, which I'm really interested in the sound aspect equally as the visual aspect of these places. And so how does the sort of natural landscape, come through the sounds, birds, the water, things like that. But a lot of these sites are constantly interrupted by human noise. And so the pieces become these sort of environments in of themselves, aside from the sort of visual aspect. And then there's a group called 1 Square Inch of Silence that did a project about human noise in the Olympic Park up near Seattle, like the only rainforest in the United States. And it's all about human noise sort of incurring on the landscape, right? And so I kind of joke around like, this is my reaction to drone footage and the tendency to take drone footage and then just put music on top of it. And so you lose all aspect of the sort of natural landscape. And so you've got this sort of disembodied drone footage flying over the landscape, but you can't use the sound because the drone sound is in the background, right? So you have to put music on top of it. So it's kind of my reaction to that. It's like a very sort of intentionally minimal viewpoint. And then all you get is the slight movement in the image and the sound. All right, I apologize for going over my time. Tomiko.
Perfect, thank you so much, Jeff. Loose narratives unfold in sculptural video installations and questionably fictional photographs. Tomiko Jones' work is linked to place, exploring transitions in the landscape in social, cultural, and geographical terms. Joan received her Master of Fine Arts in Photography with a certificate in Museum Studies from the University of Arizona in Tucson. She is a recipient of awards, including the 2013 Infoco New Works Fellowship from New York for Culture and City Arts in Seattle, and also one that I can't pronounce in France, but it looks really fancy and wonderful. Recent projects include Hatsubon, am I saying that right?
Hatsubon,
a 2-volume project in photography and video installation, the long-term project Rattlesnake Lake, and the immersive theater performance, The Gretel Project, a 4-person collaboration. Tomiko spent 3 months in various residencies in France and for a project-specific fellowship at the Camargo Foundation. Currently, Jones is an assistant professor of art at University of Wisconsin-Madison, a university that I personally love. As an educator, she was a visiting artist and curator in residence at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, assistant professor and photography program coordinator at Metropolitan State University of Denver, Mendocino College, New Mexico State University, and Drury University Summer Institute for Visual Arts. Thank you, Tomiko.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's actually really wonderful to go last because I'm already thinking about how our work ties in together. And I guess like both the previous speakers, well, Marnie, first of all, thank you for inviting me. She reached out to me and I was like, I'm literally making this work right now. And so it's only the second time I've spoken about it publicly. The first time I spoke for about 3 minutes. So I think we're all kind of in this process of making work. So I think that's really exciting. So Katie, I'm going to kind of give you a hand motion when it's time to move ahead. So we'll stay on this slide for a moment. So for me, working in the landscape is instinctual, familial, cultural, and memorial, looking at the perception of belonging to a place as visitors on the land and not following the norm of straight documentary, nor presenting a lost narrative common in the field. I need to pause right here and just say where I am. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where I went to graduate school. I'm sitting in the studio of Kate Long Hodges, who's opened up this place to share with me in Barrio Viejo. And this morning we spent the morning drinking coffee with Tomasa Rivas, who's a Tohono O'odham basket weaver and artist. And when she arrived here, she mentioned, oh, you know, this used to be a real trading post for our people. So let me just acknowledge where I am speaking from today. Next slide. So about the kind of documentary acknowledgement of photography, it also became a tool to witness, and photographers would become heralds of conservation and preservation, such as, you know, the famous Ansel Adams and his tireless work with the Sierra Club. This work continues on in contemporary practice, yet at times can remain a version of how the land is defined, protected, and seen from a specific Western perspective. So in 2018, my first year at UW-Madison, I went on a cultural landscape tour with Omar Poehler. He posed the question, what if we were to look at this place in a different way, through new eyes? How would that change how we acted? I had already began this project informally, looking at how both myself and others use the land we live on, and had started on a list of sites that was generated by the Trump administration of places to deregulate and review for privatization. So my approach in the landscape is primarily to observe as I ponder 3 of my own key questions. So these questions were previous to the pandemic, but they became to be really heightened. The first was, are we loving the land to death? So as Jeff had mentioned, you know, recreating this need to get out and kind of be out in nature. During the pandemic, this became, you know, a place for respite, right? But it also made a lot of these places really overcrowded. In a KOA survey, over 40% of people surveyed said it was the first time they'd ever camped was last summer. My second question was, who is welcome when we consider these communal public spaces? And that was a question also I had been asking myself for years, as feeling like I'm very much a visitor here, a person who's lived in many, many different geographic locations. And that was really heightened by the summer's Black Lives Matter movement. And my third question is, we ask for so much, what do we return? So just this, you know, a social and political responsibility to the environment and to the planet, but also kind of a spiritual responsibility. I'm sorry, we're going to pause on this picture for just a little bit. I want to read a paragraph. Maybe Katie, you could go back. Do you mind dashing back to the first, how about right there? So these grand places arguably began during graduate studies and an investigation into the construct of identifying land as, quote, ours. So photography as an invention and tool played a significant role, as we know in Manifest Destiny, in stories of how the West was made, identified, and conquered. From early photographs made for the USGS to privately funded expedition in search of resources, to the photographs of Edward Curtis's attempts to document the, quote, vanishing race, photography is linked to the settlement, colonization, exploitation, and ethnic genocide of the American landscape. So if you can go forward to the cyanotype process, I just am going to quickly talk about process because, so the cyanotype process is very simple. There's a light source, the sun or UV light, a negative or a object, and then light sensitized material. Next slide. I just wanted to note on that because you're going to see cyanotypes throughout this earlier part of the presentation. I went to school at the University of Arizona, and so I spent a lot of time looking in the collection here, and cyanotype was an early way for people to contact print their proofs of their glass plates. So I was just kind of following in that tradition. So these grand places visit sites on public land. In a preliminary trip to Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument in 2019, I witnessed portions of the new US-Mexico border while replaced the existing barrier. I had previously lived near the border in Arizona and in New Mexico, but on this visit, I caught a more intimate portrait of lands being bulldozed. A return trip in March 2020 was canceled due to the pandemic, but earlier this year, I returned as the previous administration was pushing to finish as much construction as possible across protected public and tribal lands. And so on the right, that's from just a couple months ago. So again, mentioning the cyanotype, I spent many hours looking at these kind of historical collections. So when it came time to make my own prints, in my initial practice, I was working a lot with 4x5 film. So on top would be a scan, kind of a traditional what could be a traditional black and white print. And on the bottom is a cyanotype print. This was also a process that I was thinking about as something that could be done in your own living room, because of course we were in the lockdown. But these grand places is not specifically about the border wall, but it's multi-layered. The project intends to look from several perspectives on land use, policy, and protection. So the time to research and photograph is essential to illustrating a deeper inquiry into place. So the bottom's a straight cyanotype, and on the top is one that's been bleached with baking soda and then toned with black tea. Again, something that's really kitchen friendly. So just fast forward, January 2021, this is my rig, the Mobile Research Studio, or the MRS, and this is leaving Madison, drove straight into a snowstorm. So this is a little bit of how it might be out in the field. So the Mobile Research Studio is a live workspace. It's fully solar powered now, besides the giant gas guzzling vehicle that's pulling it. But when I'm working in the space, I'm able to use sustainable energy, which makes me feel good, and to have this like workspace where I can be making work on site. It's not terrible to say it makes me feel good to use sustainable energy as I drive around my giant SUV. Okay, what else happens in this space? Just a couple quick little things that may happen in the studio. On the left is coding cyanotypes, on the right is a little baby printing press, and I also brought my cat with me for some company. So here on the left-hand side, this is near Guadalupe Canyon. And so what I'm showing you now are a lot of sketches and also kind of some iPhone snapshots. Because the work is so new and a lot of the images haven't been really produced or finished yet, I'm just going to kind of show you what I would call like the anecdotal stories. I just want to show you on the left the process that I'm working with now, which is a kind of 4x5 bellows style camera, but it has a digital back on it. So this is also to allow me to work a little bit more fluidly in the field without having a dark room. So here's one of the sites. So I've been working a lot along the Arizona, US-Mexico border in Arizona, and see, I'm ad-libbing. I'm probably going overtime, but these are kind of just thinking about how I want to put images together. This is the San Pedro River Conservation Area. The borderlands of Arizona are a huge percentage of them are on public land. And so in the name of national security, a lot of environmental laws have been waived. This riparian zone on the left-hand side is facing the US, and then the middle one is the border wall. And then on the right-hand side is facing the Mexico side of the border. Another image from there. So there we go. So kind of as I've been working along, I've been gathering a lot of stories and talking to people when and where I can, which has been very interesting during this time where we are hopefully emerging out of a pandemic. It's also been a time that feels more polarized than ever, and yet people sometimes are more empathetic than ever. So there's a real kind of gathering, not just of photographs, but of stories and conversations. For example, here along the border wall and talking with Border Patrol agent. And I started just kind of posting these almost as field notes, and mostly on Instagram. Here on the left is Instagram, seen on your laptop, and on the right is seen on your phone, which made me think I would really like to kind of think about how to put these anecdotal stories together in a way that was a little bit like a book form. So since I'm just literally, go to the next slide, working kind of on the fly, this is installing the solar, I just built a homepage on my website to just kind of illustrate a little bit of a daily journal. Jeff, did you see that was a drone picture? And here in the field and making some cyanotype prints along the way. Sorry about that. Okay, so thoughts on medium and process. I'm just going to whisk through these next couple images because I love photography in all sorts of ways, and I really love making prints. And so shortly before the pandemic, I just finished a small series of tricolor gum prints over cyanotype based upon this set of Hiroshige prints that are part of the Van Vleck collection in the Chazen Art Museum. And so if you look at this one, then we'll go to the next slide. Here is some of the kind of like recognizing, looking at the environs of the area that I've now moved to, and looking at different ways to kind of think about the actual like making of the object and the energy put into that. And so I'm feeling like these are going to be inspirations for where these grand places eventually go. So I'm right in the middle of this project. I'm really kind of in the gathering phase. I'm thinking about the anecdotal stories. I'm thinking about the kind of quote kind of straight landscape photographs, and then how these might be imagined later on. And go to the next slide here. Just a couple of days ago, I was able to meet Mary Statzer at the University of New Mexico Museum of Art and look at Patrick Nagatani's Nuclear Enchantment series, which I've always been really drawn to, made in the 1990s. And so that was just really kind of special moment to think about how he was looking at the radioactive landscape, especially in the New Mexico area, a place that I've spent some time, lived, and also taught in. And the very next day, I drove back up to Taos and into a snowstorm. And so that's my little after Nagatani image. So I just wanted to end by looking forward to the conversation we're about to have, since no one ever gets to show a cactus silhouette and a moon and a sunset all at once. In an exhibition, I thought I would end with that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to stop share so we can see each other. Does that seem like a good idea? And of course, so I'm happy to jump back in and reference images should we need to. That was great. And, you know, even knowing the bit I did know about your work, there's so much strong overlap. And I think one of the sort of main questions that was kind of coming to me, especially since we have a large group of students here today, is, and this might be too broad of a question, but I'm wondering, what do you, when you're choosing the photos, when you're making the photos, especially when there's something like very politically fraught, I'm thinking maybe Marnie of some of your images, Jeff, I'm thinking of the image of the chair. How do you decide what to reveal and what to conceal? How do you know that that is the image that you need to represent the underlying themes that are important to you? And I know that's a hard question, but I'd love to hear you just ruminate a little bit about that.
Marnie.
I was going to say, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good question. I think it comes down to it kind of, you start to think about documentary photography in that aspect, in that I like what Marnie kind of said, I'm not going to make you talk right now, Marnie, but I like what she said about just turning around and seeing that image, you know, and seeing how it affected the landscape and seeing how the camera interpreted it, right? Because it's different than our eyes. So in some ways, I think that's it. You just have to wander around a space, and, you know, a place like when I shot the Steve Harris chair, I had spent 3 or 4 days there already, and I felt like the images I was making weren't doing it. You know, some of them were, but they weren't telling the full story. And so that to me is, you kind of know it when you shot it, and that I know that sounds like old school, like like Wintergrand or something, but you know, you kind of realize when you've made the image. I think sometimes that you've made the image that represents it, but a lot of that for me comes, you know, back in the studio when I'm scanning everything in and working in the studio and editing everything down. So I tend to overshoot when I'm on the site. But Marnie.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I see a lot of my students in here and some unknowns, but you know, we always talk about trusting your instinct. And Katie, you sometimes use the phrase fast thinking, I think, for our grad students. But there's a moment where, you know, you just kind of are making and making and you have to reflect back. And this was the first time I prefer, I mean, I have this terrible slash great way. It's an awful way to get money and grants, but you know, to just kind of go somewhere and listen to me is really important. So I like spent money on this trip. I was just like, I'm going to do it cheap, old grad school style, you know, stay at random ranches with friends, like in the middle of nowhere with scorpions and stuff, and hang out. And I was like, and I'm going to listen and see what happens with the work. And so I have so much work. Like I can even see there's like boxes in my corner of stuff I still haven't photographed. And I made so many, but the minute I made that, I was like, ooh, you just kind of get the chills. And I was like, there's something about this. I don't know what it is. And so it's kind of that trusting instinct that we try to teach you guys to develop in school, that it's hard to teach.
And I think that's also interesting in really, Tomiko, I'll let you talk real quick, sorry. I think that's also interesting just in terms of what Tomiko was talking about, this idea of documentary photography, which really none of you are necessarily doing that. Tomiko, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, when Marnie made that comment about turning and looking the other way, I have reflected a lot on that being at the border wall, because it's such an intense psychological space. And one day I went out and there was like a trail of peanut shells, and I've been walking for about 30 minutes. It was super hot. And I followed these peanut shells, and then I started making cyanotypes of them. And because they look like little clouds. And I was thinking about Alfredo Yar's work when he was photographing Rwanda, and just like literally like photographing the massacre, and he was so overwhelmed by the content of the work, and almost like he didn't even know if he wanted to show it or if he needed to show it to talk about like how horrible what he was seeing. And he turned his camera up and took a picture of this cloud. And so I always kind of reflect on that, about what we choose to share. So he shared the story, but he didn't show us the pictures. So sometimes it's the power of the moment when we turn the other way, I think, that can be really powerful in illustrating the quote, the document of the situation.
Yeah. I think too, something that struck me with all of your work is this sort of sustained practice. And that sustained practice is so much involved with research. And I know, Tomiko, you touched a little bit on this research, and that this sort of, it's a little bit indecipherable to me, what is research and what is just living in a space and being really aware of your surroundings. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this process of research, and maybe the sort of things that occur, like the difference between going into a site and expecting to know what you're going to photograph versus what sort of ends up happening instead. And whether or not that has to do with sort of conversations you have with people, or you know, even these peanuts that you saw, or what are these sort of threads that help develop this project further?
Yeah, I really feel like the immersion into place is so essential to the way that I work, in particular, probably all of you as well. And so it's really time, like it's the commitment of time. And I forgot who said listening earlier, right? About being able to listen and try not to have too much expectation. Like, you know, I do some homework, I read some articles, I look at maps, I do all that. And then when I get to a place, I try to be open about what might happen. So in fact, yesterday I was kind of annoyed by my neighbors because they were very noisy. I was camping and I was like, there you go, the noise thing, right? And then the woman, she ran out and wanted to talk to me, and then told me about this dam that she was really curious about. And then she gave me a burrito that she'd made to take on the road with me. And I thought, wow, if I just can, I don't know if that was a very good story, but I guess like the element of like social engagement and staying open. So I was supposed to leave, but I took an hour hike out to this dam because I actually am really interested in watershed as well. So I had to go take a look at it before I left New Mexico and came to Arizona. So I guess in terms of the research, like there's the formal research, but I feel like the being in time and being observant is what ends up really being one of my bigger guiding forces ultimately. And then of course it all comes together hopefully along the way.
Yeah, I agree. I like what you said about the formal research being very different than being in the space. Because it's like you do the research, come up with all these photographs in my head before I'm even there. And I get there and I'm like, that's going to be a really boring photograph. It's going to be like a photograph, of pollution, like trying to photograph pollution, which is basically impossible because of a lot of it's invisible, right? So yeah, I think being in the space is really important, and just being open, just like Tomiko said, just being really open to experiences and different, aspects that totally unexpected things coming up. One of the things that happened to me is I was photographing the coal ash spill, and I would have to stand on the back of my truck with this big, 8x10 camera or 4x5 camera, and people would just want to know what I was doing up there, you know what I mean? Because they don't even know what that kind of camera looks like, really. And so some of the portraits I ended up taking for the project were actually people that just lived around that area, that were just curious. And so if I wasn't, if it was just like zeroed in on making that landscape photograph, I would have never been able to learn about what these people were actually going through, which I wasn't able to research because the spill had only happened a month before, so a lot of it was sort of private, just between the TVA and the people that were affected by the spill. And so I was able to kind of, start talking to the local population, which was something, I'd struggled with trying to find anybody that would want to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me how much the sort of formal research then prepares you to make those decisions in the field. I have other questions, but I thought I would open it up to the audience. I think you can ask a question in the chat box. Can the audience do that, Dave?
I think there's a separate Q&A box for them.
Oh, there's a Q&A box. Oh, here it is.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yep.
I see it. Okay. Are there questions from our audience?
That was my first time in a webinar.
I know, me too. It's very cool. I like how it's done. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to put those questions in the box. Marnie and Tomiko, I'm wondering, how is it to present such new work? And in putting these presentations together, were you able to sort of come to a new understanding of the work?
I mean, new work is something I'm glad I'm not in school for all the students still here in mine. Like there's a moment where you have to present work so quickly, and we watched, and we start off my semester. I always start my advanced class with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. He has a documentary called like 20,000 Days on Earth or something. And in it, he's talking about making new work. And one thing is like, you have this piece of work, and he's like, it's on Amazon Prime, I think, Tomiko. And he's like, and he talks, and he's just like, he's talking about narrating a song, but it's like a song is like a little flame in your hand, and you hold it and you want to protect it from the whole world until it grows into a flame and can kind of live on its own. So making new work, like for me, I don't like to talk about it. It kind of ruins it when it's in this early stage. Now I'm moving to the production phase of this work. So like, it's not as scary, but I waited a year and a half at least from starting, or 2 years from making it. And then I very quietly changed my whole website and put it up. And then I made one single post during the election about this new work. And then people are like, oh my gosh, you're making this. And so, but I'm still kind of, for me, it's not big enough yet I've been applying for grants and all that stuff to do it, but it's not big enough yet to show or have big talks. So I'm doing little things. So like when Dave was like, will you speak with this? I was like, yes, I can do 10 minutes. Like, but if you ask me to go 20, it gets a little scarier. And I gave a talk last year, 2 years ago, as part of my, as part of having this the Provost Fellowship. I was required to speak, or I did through the school. So, and that was like, oh gosh, this is so new. I didn't even know what I was making. I showed a whole bunch of other stuff too. So it's scary, guys.
Right. And it's not due at the end of the semester, right? So thankfully. Yeah, I thought it was really kind of fun to put it together. I mean, I did feel like I don't really know what the finished product exactly is. And I also, it was in my notes, but I just want to note that I am working from a grant from the School of Education, University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm super grateful for having this grant to have the time and space. I was working on it on the West Coast before, like this list of places came out under review, and they were like places I lived near or had spent a lot of time in or had like lived in the state next to, because a lot of them are in the American West. And I felt kind of horrified. What, they're going to just like do away with all this public land, or they're going to open it up for uranium drilling or fracking or whatever, timber industry, all these various things. And I kind of panicked, but I didn't want to run out and like do kind of a, let me photograph this place before it disappears, which, there's always that tendency that kind of, especially with photography. So I would say that I had slowly been working on it, but now I've really been able to get into it, but it's still very much in the sketch stage. So yeah, it's a little terrifying to have that out here. It's being recorded, people are going to see it, but I also think it's really exciting. It's to share work with your colleagues in the community as it's being made, because I think the response could potentially be influential.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to make a quick note real quick to like those watching that like how important keeping just track, like Tomiko, your Instagram is what, like literally this conversation's coming up. I'm speaking with Dave from the Willson Center, and you had literally been posting about a post doing your solar panels. And I was like, oh my gosh. So like, just because you keep track of something, I was like, oh my gosh, Tomiko's perfect. Let's have, kind of can make all these connections, but it's important in some ways, kind of students.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna reach behind me and pull an artifact for a question. So I'm not.
Okay. I feel like this is a group exhibition that we're putting together. We have a question, and I think this is a really important question. Andrew Zawacki asks, I'm wondering at what point any of you can answer this. You decide how and where to incorporate text into your project, whether that text is explanatory, contextual, anecdotal, or whatever. So text in your work, how does it, maybe Jeff, you could answer that.
I can answer that. I've always thought it was really important to have text with my work. I try not to share the work without the text. And I don't know how I define it, whether it's explanatory. It does usually tell the backstory of the image, right? So if you look at the first image we showed, the Blue Ridge paper mill, that place has a 125-year history that is really hard to summarize, but I do want it to be clear that it's not just a beautiful picture of a paper mill, and I do want it to sort of grab your attention and realize that it is a place of extreme sort of abuse, if that makes sense. So I don't want it to be just this beautiful picture. I want it to be able to tell a story, and a lot of the time the text is how I do that. And usually it's in the exhibition or in a book. And I do try to do it online as much as possible, but online doesn't always work as well as you want it to. But yeah, so for me, it's at the very beginning, like it comes out of the research and it's sort of with me the whole time. And then it's just a matter of including it when I show the work.
And I'm going to guess, Jeff, that both, I know my other work, it's all very text heavy, but that I would say you and I are both really heavily influenced by Joel Sternfeld's on this site. I'm going to guess, just by the way our texts both read that. So it was one of the first works. You should look it up. I'll type it in the chat in the question box under Andrew's question. But it's work that really puts a site and then gives you the textual information, and then you relate the two. It's explanatory, but not in the same breath.
Well, Taryn Simon did a similar thing with The Innocents. That was really influential on my textual use as well.
Thank you. We have another question. What led you to where you are? And maybe this could be a shortened answer, AKA what made you want to do this form of photography?
Maybe I'll start, because I don't know how that's a long answer about how I got led here. But it said when you ask this form of photography, I think that's really interesting, because I feel like in some ways I'm pushing against an impulse to kind of do a straight up visual reaction to tragedy, disaster. I mean, we could look at at the situation as a crisis, right? It's a crisis of land, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's an environmental crisis, it's a climate crisis, right? It's a crisis of the dignity of the human race, treating each other properly. But we can look at it a lot of different ways. But I first started working in photography during the environmental movement, which is quite some time ago now. And I felt so upset when I would come back from the clear cuts and seeing the old growth forests get cut down that I couldn't even like work with the photographs anymore. And so maybe that's where the turning the camera a little bit this way, or looking like in more, I don't know if I want to say metaphorical ways, but to talk about content that's not so direct. And I'm just going to answer the writing question in there. I think that's where, for me, a lot of times it's more anecdotal, because I'm not a scientist and I'm not, technically a researcher. And so I feel like if there's any experience I can write about, it's usually the experience that I'm having at the moment, based on the information I have and the experience I'm having in place. So I think what led me to this form of photography was like caring so deeply about the place that I was and trying to find a way to express that.
I'm going to dovetail and also dovetail on Elisa's question, which is artifacts. So like the new work I'm making started because I was deeply moved by what was happening and felt I didn't know what was going on, and I was reading all these horrible stories. And so I wanted to be a witness and use my privilege, in a sense, as a white woman, to be able to tell stories that other people weren't capable of telling. So I just pulled back, and like my favorite, so I collect when I go. I think similar to you, Tomiko, like I just collect everything when I'm first I call it's like, I used to call my work social listening because I listen to Twitter, but now I just listen on site. And so I go to these sites and I collect everything, like sound pieces. And my favorite sound I have, which I will probably never use, is you can, the children when I was at Dilly were just being reunited with their parents back in, but you also hear children over the age of 11 are still separated and then reunited again. And so much goes on there, but I could hear the children. You can hear them play against the wall. So I purposely was outside and never wanted to go, although I had opportunities, did not want to go in the detention center because I wanted to still be a layperson in a sense. But you could hear all the kids screaming after dinner, just playing in the fields at night. And it was it was a great sound. But I also have this object I had to pull. This is my favorite object, Elise, you will appreciate. This is, I think it's two pairs of shoes. It's two pairs of shoes. And so I also did volunteer work at the same time, and I would just listen and not make art. But I was volunteering at the bus station where most people there are about 200 of 250 people will be dropped off every day in San Antonio from detention centers, which is a smaller amount. Most people are actually dropped off at the airport because they have airline tickets. But these are someone's shoes they crossed the border with. You're handed your effects and your stuff that you came over with the border that's been held in the detention, basically in prison. It's been held in prison in these clear plastic bags, and everyone walks with them. And people would walk in and just throw their old stuff out. And this is like this, you can see they're still like caked in mud from their crossing. And it's just like, I don't know what to do with it. It's so overwhelming. Photographs don't work. Nothing works for it. So it just lives here. And I have this box that has to go to my studio, but it's full of objects. That's my favorite object. I don't know what to do with. I've never shown it to anyone either, because I'm like, I took this, but it was in a public trash can outside of the bus station. But it's this moment where you just see people, and and it happens every single day. And those are the things I was like, if I didn't know to look for this, if I didn't do a little bit of research and educate, and then if I didn't open my eyes.
I think that also
I'm curious about your objects.
Yeah. I think that also goes back to this idea of what is concealed and what is revealed, and those sort of choices that you make, and how that concealment and that revelation is so deeply entwined to even our understanding of those spaces. Okay, going on to that question that Marnie just answered, what are some of your favorite physical artifacts, not necessarily art related, that you've collected through the travels associated with these bodies of work? I don't know if anyone else, that might be a hard one to follow, or if there's any other, it's okay. If there's
it's
a great question. If there are any other sort of significant objects that come out of this work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you saw, I don't know if you could see that one posed the rusty cans, Cyanotype. So I try to actually, I mean, Marnie's right. I collect everything, stories, experiences, objects. I'm trying not to collect too much. And I sometimes feel like I don't want to take anything. So I try to do a lot of prints on site. And sometimes I photograph them, but a lot of times I'm doing these imprints. I've been doing, quite a few cyanotypes, and then doing a little bit of like rubbings and other kinds of ways to like capture an image that's not so directly lens based. Then I can leave it behind. I don't know if that was a very good answer. So I have an impulse. I have a background in anthropology. That's what my undergrad is. So I am very much like interested in material culture, but I've been really like see the thing and then leave it where it is. And also not wanting to have such a, I mean, primarily because I'm in the landscape. This might be different if I was in a city or another place or was gifted an object, but try not to have such an impact on the space that I'm working in this particular work.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I thought it was really interesting what Marnie said about collecting sounds. And I think that was one kind of new thing I did with the Western work, was that I started shooting a lot of video. And that's kind of my favorite thing right now, is like collecting those videos, even if I don't end up using them, just having the sort of sound. And because I was an undergrad film major, so like I think for the longest time I've been pushing that away, and I'm finally starting to embrace that again. And so the sounds, just sitting there for 10, because the video is usually about 10 minutes long. So sitting there for 10 minutes, trying to be as quiet as I can, just recording that space becomes its own kind of thing that I just hang on to and can just like go back to and just watch and like re-experience in a limited way that space again.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to share your work with us on Earth Day, a very pressing, urgent, important Earth Day. And I also really want to, again, thank Global Georgia Initiative and the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts for putting this panel together. And so without further ado, I encourage you to go outside, to not make a big impact on the landscape today, but do go outside and observe your surroundings. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.